you don't have to listen to every piece of feedback. Sometimes you get bad feedback because I just don't think you hear that very much. And especially like, I think as a woman, when you're trying to be, well, how do I address all of this feedback, to hear like, oh, some of it is just bad, was incredibly eye-opening, like a big paradigm shift for me.
Hi, I am Sophie Vaux, and this is the Rise and Play podcast. In the show, I sit down with influential thought leaders in the gaming industry to deconstruct how they create the best teams and company cultures in order to create the best games. Speaking to hundreds of game executives in the show, I have identified recurring patterns and mistakes that we all make in our leadership journey. Do you have to go through the same hurdles and make the same mistakes to learn too? You are not alone in this journey, and hopefully, you can learn from a diverse range of seasoned leaders who already walk the talk. Every episode brings actionable insights and case studies that will help you improve your management skills, self-awareness, and empathic communication. Becoming a better leader starts with becoming a better human. Are you ready to unlock your full potential in life and business? Let's begin.
Hello, and welcome to the podcast Rise and Play. I am Nina Kim, and I'll be helping to host this episode. Today, I'm super excited to speak with our guest, Crystin Cox. She is currently the Director of Business Strategy for Xbox Game Studios Publishing. Before joining Xbox in 2019, she spent 16 years as a game developer working on large-scale online games with teams at ArenaNet, Nexon, and Disney. Over the course of her career, Crystin has focused on game design and direction, monetization strategy, and live ops, while also being active in the game developer community as a frequent speaker and writer, and also as the host of the podcast, The Art of LiveOps. Welcome, Crystin. It's so nice to have you here.
Hey, thank you. I'm so excited that you asked me to come do this.
Well, it's going to be super fun. So why don't you tell us about your journey? How did you start in games?
So I went to school for theatrical, scenic, and lighting design. I went there with the dream of making movies. Like, I always wanted to make movies. It was what I wanted to do since I was little. That was down in Los Angeles and absolutely delivered to me all the things that they said they would. I got connections. I met people in the film and television industry. When I got out of school, I started working in the film and television industry, and I absolutely hated it. It was just horrible. And I was on like a break between seasons of a show, and I was like complaining to friends that I went to school with that I like didn't like my job. They had gone to school for animation, and they were like, "You should make video games. You are the biggest nerd we know. You love video games more than any of us." And like a bunch of us are working in video games because video games had just become 3D. And so like they were sort of taking a lot of their animation skills and moving them into video games. And I was like, I don't really know how to program. I can like barely do anything with programming. And they're like, no, there's like other things you could do. I went and got a QA job at THQ. And I thought I'd just do it in between like seasons of this TV show, and I'd go back to, trying to get my union card and all that fun stuff for film and television, but absolutely fell in love with it. Like, it was the opposite of the film and television experience where I loved everyone I was working with, even though it was terrible hours. And it was, like there's all these horror stories about QA, especially from that era. But I loved everyone I worked with, and the industry felt really fresh. And there was like this attitude that things were possible and we were going to do something new and innovative and try things that wasn't really, I didn't feel in the film and television industry at the time. Like, it felt very sort of stymied and like shrinking. So I just never went back at all. I stayed in video games. Like, I started in QA and then just sort of tried to take my background and my education and move it into working in sort of like art support, and then got into doing design pretty quickly. I actually started working in MMOs almost right away, which is sort of luck of the draw at the time. But as often happens in the industry, like I ended up staying working mostly in like MMOs and really large scale live games for a really long time after that.
So you had a very interesting journey into starting in the games industry. After QA, eventually you ended up designing and then becoming a lead and leading your own team. What approach did you use when you first started?
Yeah, I think like a lot of people in the industry, looking back, I feel like I became a lead too early. I feel like almost everyone feels that way because you're never prepared, really. You kind of don't know what you don't know. I mean, I don't regret any of it, but I will say that when I first started leading, my approach was very results oriented. I was like very much about like getting things done and getting things managed and handled and like driving for results and driving for excellence. I think there were some good things about that, but I also think I had a lot to learn about like people management and relationships and the way that like we motivate people and like the way everybody is sort of motivated differently. But starting, I was definitely like very much like results, drive forward, like let's do it. I've always been a little bit, I've always been very optimistic and like encouraging, but I was definitely like super driven. And I think like to the point where it was exhausting, probably. Like there was just this drive to like go get excellence and like make things happen. And I think that that's, in some ways too not that unusual from coming from like a theater background, like a very like project based background where you know there's this idea that like, well, we're all going to pull together to get to this moment in time where we've made the thing. But working especially in live ops games, it was fairly quick before I realized like, wow, there has to be something more to this because we're just burning ourselves out all the time, or like I'm not being as effective as I wish I was because just motivating through like driving and focusing on results all the time is not necessarily making for the happiest team.
So, how did you adjust to that after making that realization?
I owe so much to training. I got so much out of just getting exposed to good management training. I worked with some good leaders when I was at Nexon who prioritized us getting manager training and actually having experts come in and talk to us about like the way people are motivated, the kinds of things that work and don't work, and just like the people part of management was helpful. And I think almost more helpful because they came in not from games, they came as management experts who were like, yeah, you guys are great at all of the parts where you know all the technical stuff about making games. That's not what you need training on. Like what you need training on is understanding how to manage a team and work with your team and grow your team. That was really, really helpful. The first really formal management training I had, I got exposed to a couple of like books that were really influential to me, like Crucial Conversations is one that I highly recommend people read. It's a really like practical guide to having hard conversations that was super influential. Getting some outside perspective as well to understand the way I am motivated and like the things that I think are important for me to hear from like my manager and the things that I want to know, really recognizing as well that those are not necessarily what my team doesn't necessarily share those. Like they might be motivated by different things. I can't just say, well, this would work for me, so obviously it's going to work for everybody else. Was a huge turning point for me, I think, as a manager and a leader, and started me down a road where I spent a lot more time, I think, trying to think like strategically and philosophically about what it means to lead and what I'm like, what kind of leader I wanted to be.
During that time, did you have anyone that you would identify as a source of inspiration, or was it more the training and the books that you read?
I had some really good managers early in my career, which I am incredibly grateful for. My first like real manager who I like had a manager relationship with was Gail Oda when I was at NCSoft. And she was fantastic. Like she was really great as a mentor. I think she gave me a lot of great modeling for how to be effective and also compassionate and thoughtful. I think she was a really good model for me to have. And it was also really nice. I think I'm very lucky to have had a great manager early in my career who was also a woman, because I just think that was, a little bit rare, as it turns out, in the industry. But I was really lucky to have it. I worked under a woman at Nexon named Andy Williams, who had come from outside of games. She'd been a VP at IDEO, and she had a huge influence on me as a creative leader, a really big influence on me, just in the her approach to how she managed not only people but products and the creative process and design that was, really, really influential to me. So I definitely got a ton out of working with her as well. So I think I was lucky. I've had some really good models that I've had personal interactions with earlier in my career that I think was really influential for me. And I do feel very lucky to have had that, because I know I've also spent, plenty of time in the industry in positions where there was no women, in positions of leadership above me at all. So I feel really lucky to have had that. And I also think that there's just some stuff that is not impossible, but can be difficult to get without having some mentors in your career that have some shared cultural experience with you. Some of the best advice I've ever gotten from a manager that I've tried to pass on to other people: you don't have to listen to every piece of feedback. Sometimes you get bad feedback. And it blew my mind. Yes, that's feedback, and it's good that you're hearing it, but sometimes you just get bad feedback. And you have to evaluate it and think about whether or not this feedback is actually useful, because I just don't think you hear that very much. And especially I think as a woman, when you're trying to, how do I address all of this feedback, to hear oh, some of it is just bad, was incredibly eye-opening, a big paradigm shift for me.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it kind of sounds like getting design feedback. It's not exactly that the feedback is correct or reflective of what it's saying, but it's coming from somewhere, and you can evaluate where that's coming from and then see do they really mean what they're saying, or is it coming from some other place?
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it too, right? You're right. When you get design feedback, you don't just go, oh, face value, whatever it says is exactly what I'm going to implement. You have to stop and really do this critical thinking around, okay, it means something, but what it might mean might have very little to do with the design. It might have a lot to do with the person giving the feedback. In the same way, it is hard to get to a place where you can do that in your career, though. And it can be maybe a dangerous piece of advice sometimes, because you do need to listen to how you're coming off with everyone else around you. But at some point, you hope to get to a place where you have the ability to really look at that objectively.
I totally agree. With your experience, I know you've worked in multiple studios that have relations in different countries. So how was it to play a part in a leadership position as a woman in an environment where you encountered different cultural and ethnical backgrounds?
Yeah. When I went to work for Nexon, I worked for Nexon America in the office that was in Los Angeles, but our office was heavily Korean. I think we were 75% or more Korean, and a lot of the people who worked there had already worked for Nexon and had moved over. Not all of them, but quite a few of them, especially in the leadership positions, had come from the sort of the main headquarters for Nexon. And I knew when I went over there that that likely I would work with a team that was at least partially in Korea, that was partially in Seoul, which was true. Half the team I worked with was in Seoul. As a leader, I think the thing for me that was most influential about it, was most interesting, was just getting the exposure to working in another culture. in that space where you're constantly like reliant to some extent on other people, and you're not getting the sort of first wave of communication, I was very influential for me. I think it taught me more patience. I think it taught me more humility. I think, and it filtered eventually into a lot of design for me, a lot of my design thinking as a designer, as a game designer, like very much like trying to be very cognizant of the fact that something that feels natural to me does not necessarily feel natural to most other people. And you really have to dig into those biases and understanding. Working when I was at ArenaNet, helping to bring Guild Wars 2 to China, and we worked with a partner in China for several years really closely. There was a lot of work there to understand as well that, this is a gaming culture that just has a totally different history than we do. And when we like inadvertently do things like reference like using a game controller for, especially at the time, a gaming culture that probably 90% of them have never held a controller. They're gamers who are like, yeah, like we don't do that. Like we don't play games on controllers. We play games on computers or phones.
I've definitely found that moving from the US to the UK, I didn't think there would be as much of a difference, but there are a lot of differences. Yeah.
I think the other difference too, and I hear people talk about this all the time, is that those cultures also have their own unique business cultures, right? America has a business culture. The UK has a business culture. France has a business culture. Korea has a business culture. Korean culture did influence me a lot as a manager. And like, not exactly in that like, oh, I think I manage like a Korean boss, but it was an interesting perspective because in Korean business generally, these are all generalizations, every Korean company is going to be different, but there's this idea that your success in your career is your boss's responsibility, and that they need to be working to manage that for you, and that they're going to be very like held pretty accountable to like whether or not you have growth, but that you don't have as much active work to do that. Like your job is to do the things that your boss like tells you to do, and then it's their job to manage your career. I do think it gave me an interesting perspective, and then I do try to carry forward a little bit, not forgetting that I do have a responsibility as a leader for helping manage my teams and my reports career. But then on the other hand, like one of the reasons I left and I like walked away from working at a Korean company was as an American, I definitely was like, but I have ideas about what I want my career to be like, and I want to go drive that myself. And I think that that's valid as well. But I do think people can underestimate how different the business culture can be. And I've certainly seen teams, like really well-meaning teams, get together to work on something coming from two different cultures and just be talking across each other, not understanding each other, running into problems, not acknowledging what their words mean to each other, because it's not always the same in every culture. I think that's really challenging, is accepting, like, if you're used to working primarily in America, when you want to go work with a team that isn't American, you kind of have to open yourself up and just say, like, I shouldn't assume anything. Like, let's wait and see how this team actually works.
Definitely. I mean, I've also heard that different cultures communicate feedback in different ways. Like my parents, when they give feedback, it's very critical because they think that's a service. It's sort of like, I respect you enough to give you very critical feedback that will help you improve. But to other people, it might just sound like harassment.
Yeah. Yeah, this like idea too that in some cultures it's like, well, I wouldn't want you to have like, how rude of me to make you guess what I mean. Like I should tell you very exactly, and that's a sign of respect. And then in other cultures, it's going to be like, wow, you have to really, come at it from this sort of other point of view. You have to really like lead people down a path, and you can't be, harsh. And it like really varies. I know like I've had experiences as well with working in China where we've just gotten into this mode where it can be very challenging sometimes for a Chinese team. This varies, but like certainly our partner, it was hard for them to say no. Like they wouldn't say no. If we said, oh, hey, we really want this, oftentimes they would say, ooh, that's going to be really hard. And we just wouldn't hear it. Like, we'd have leaders on our team that would be like, oh, okay, well, we'll get you some more resources. And it's like, no, you guys, that's no. That's a no. And if you keep pushing, it's going to get really uncomfortable. And it sometimes did get really uncomfortable. It was like, they're actually saying no. And I'm sure on their side, they're like, why? People are being so pushy. We're clearly like saying that we can't do this. And they're like, just keep pushing it until we have to like say this really embarrassing thing. That could be so challenging to work out when you don't even know you're doing it to each other.
With how impressive your reputation is and how extensive your experience is, I imagine you would have many paths to choose from. So what factors influence you to join the role that you lead today at Xbox?
So it came from, I think, two places. One, if I'm being honest, was I had a project that I was leading that failed. And it was definitely a big moment of reflection. And I sort of at the time characterized it as like, oh, I have a broken heart and I kind of need to heal it somehow. And I did not think jumping back in to another like game team was going to be great. So I did kind of try to stop and look around and ask like, well, what could I go do that would be a little different? I honestly like wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I went and I started working with Xbox on the developer tools side as sort of like a consultant. I think we called me an evangelist for LiveOps, just sort of like trying to explain to people what LiveOps was. And I went around and gave workshops and spoke and started the podcast, which was fun. The Art of LiveOps Podcast, which is fun. And through that, I actually met Peter Wise, who's the head of Xbox Game Studios Publishing, and he had actually just come in to take over that role. I just was really impressed with like his ideas and like what he wanted to do with publishing. And that seemed like, talking to him, I was like, oh, it seems like I could get an opportunity to work on a lot of things from this perspective. And so I was lucky for him to like take a chance. I don't really have like traditional publishing experience before this. So it was also an opportunity for me to do something different and a little bit new. And so that's how I ended up doing it. And in a lot of ways, it has given me the things I wanted, which was I get to work on a lot of different things at once. I've got to focus on strategy, which is a passion for me. A lot of studios just don't get the luxury to think about strategy very much. And so that's been nice, like to have a little bit more of an opportunity because of the role that publishing plays. We have a little more perspective to think about strategy and get that opportunity to work on a lot of different games at once and help a lot of teams figure out what they want to do. I spent a lot of time thinking about live ops still. I still care quite a bit about live ops, but now just generally thinking about how to help devs think about business. I think way too often in this industry, business sort of translates into, well, how do we maximize revenue or how do I maximize profit? When I think it's actually very complex, especially when you think about it from a strategy point of view. In long-term relationships with players and long-term relationships with developers and creative and doing new things. So I'm really excited to get an opportunity to help teams try to think about business from a holistic point of view and to think about what they want for their teams and what they want for their players and try to build plans that are going to go like hopefully make that happen. It's a volatile industry, obviously, and we don't always get to achieve the things we want, but my hope from this position is to have more teams think about business and strategy from a like human-centric, designer-led point of view that doesn't ignore the realities of economics. Yep, they're there and they're real and we have to think about them all the time, but actually tries to ask these more holistic, human-centered questions about what are we trying to do? Why are we doing it? What do you want for your studio? What do you want for this game? Like, what is success? So I think just getting the opportunity to do those things doesn't come along every day. Like it's been a real privilege. I've really enjoyed my time at Xbox. And I think it's also helped me get a better perspective on balance. Like I think about that, like being in that place I was when I left my last job and I was heartbroken and I do think a little bit now about, oh, I think I'm a little more resilient. I think I'm a little bit more understanding of the bigger picture because I do get to see so many teams in so many states go through so many things. I think it does has helped me have more perspective about the industry and about the creative process.
That all sounds so great. I mean, I feel like the teams are really lucky to have you as well, especially pushing for this sort of viewpoint where you're considering everything. And when you have that sort of way of thinking, that holistic, human-centric way of thinking, it's a really benefit to everyone because it'll keep players happy. It'll keep your teammates happy. It's a very healthy way of going about things. So I'm really happy that you're there for them.
I hope so. I'm also a pragmatist. So like there's a part of me that's like, I hope that's what my hope is. Like my dream is that all those things are happening with every project because it's hard. It's a tough industry. I think all entertainment industries are pretty hard, but we're a difficult industry. I think we're full of really great creatives who want to do something new and interesting, who want to connect with players on an emotional level, and making that fit into the mold of business and economics is hard. It is really hard. So that's the dream, is that we bring that to bear and it makes a better experience for everybody. In the absence of that, I hope that I can bring good perspective, and a knowledge that we're trying to do it in a way that makes sense, and trying to do it in a way that cares about that. And that we're sharing that together with our developers, and we're working through things. That's, I hope.
I think you're doing a great job supporting that. I personally have seen the effects of that from you. So I think in the industry, we get so caught up in, just pushing for what makes the most money, what's effective in data and what pushes players to spend. But then we don't think about the motivations of the player or anything that's good for them. But we have proof that caring about them and like doing things for them, for the benefit of them, actually works. We just kind of get lost in it and ignore it.
I think it's really hard for all systems to care about the long term when the short term is in conflict. I try to be like empathetic about that and like acknowledge like that is hard. I will say like it is one of those things that when you think about strategy, you're always a little frustrated because it does feel like, I do think I actually recently, this is going to sound dark and I don't mean it to, like said to my boss, like sometimes it feels like my job is to push a boulder up the hill, that the natural state of the system is to crush us. And that what I need to do is just keep pushing the boulder up the hill. So all my effort just keeps it from crushing us. And that boulder kind of represents things like short-term thinking, pressure for things that like in the long term maybe don't matter that much, like pressure for, a crisis that's happening at this moment. Those are the things that systematically want to gobble up all of our energy, all of our time, and all of our thoughts. And if you don't actively push the boulder up the hill, it runs down the hill and like crushes somebody down at the bottom. That sounds dark. I think my boss is like, okay, but then there's like positives, right? I was like, yes, there's lots of positives. It feels really good when you keep the boulder up the hill or you get to uncover something that the team wouldn't be able to do if you weren't, pushing the boulder up the hill. But it's true, you have to acknowledge that like the systems are not often set up to think about things like from a long-term perspective, a strategy perspective, or a human-centered perspective. And it takes effort, like real effort to do it. I feel the same way about monetization. Like you can take the point of view of let's just extract the most money we can. You can take the point of view of I hate monetization and it's evil and I don't want to touch it. In a lot of ways, those are really the easy points of view. I think you have to be willing to engage with it and try to like find a way through, but it's hard. That's work.
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, working in free-to-play, I've seen a lot of players who actually express that they love spending. And it doesn't even have to mean like spending real life money or like hard currency, soft currency, they just like being able to like put value and grow something in a game that they're involved in. Sometimes like if we don't think about like what makes them happy, like it just ends up being transactional. It doesn't have any meaning to it. Or we just completely shut it out. We're like, oh, we don't want to make players spend, so we just won't have anything. And that's sad for them because they want to be able to invest in something and that makes them feel good. So it's a delicate balance.
It is. It's hard.
All these things that you ran into, is that why you started your podcast and you started doing talks? What was the point where you ended up making the decision to start doing these things?
I think like some of it was I like wanted to be out there more. I got invited to participate in this design think tank called Project Horseshoe that unfortunately doesn't exist anymore, but it did for a long time. And it was like this weekend where for people who don't know what Horseshoe is, like it's a weekend where a bunch of game designers would get together and like divvy up problems to think about and then talk about them, and we all came from different places with different backgrounds and different studios, but we would work on these problems together and write a white paper. And it really made me, I think, more hungry for having that connection with the rest of the industry and not like, not just thinking, well, how can I learn things or develop, skills that's going to help my game, and instead be like, well, how could the whole industry, benefit from each other? How do we share this? Because it was so invigorating to get together with other people from outside of my company and share these things and talk about these things. And GDC, I'd also been to GDC many times and, I had experiences where I heard talks that inspired me. And so I was like, well, I want to do more of that. Like, I want to get out there. I had a lot of feelings about monetization, specifically live ops, that I thought I was a little frustrated at times. There was a time where I was very frustrated with, I had been exposed to a particular like kind of thinking and some data earlier in my career working in free-to-play games that came out of Korea. And then I was sort of seeing some like best practices and like sort of conventional wisdom develop in the West as the West sort of started doing free-to-play that like I honestly like just didn't agree with some of it, and was very much like, well, I wish I could share some of my perspective on this and maybe even like counteract some of this conventional wisdom. And eventually I was like, well, okay, like if I really want to do that, like I should go out there and try to find a venue to do it. And so I was doing a lot of speaking. I was going around and speaking at conferences, writing some papers and blog posts and things. And then when I very first came over to Xbox and I was working on the tool side, I worked with the founder of PlayFab, James Gersman, and he was like, I want to start a podcast because, like, of course he did. He was like, I really want to start one. And so I was like, okay, well, like, what do you want it to be about? And we talked about it for a while. And we landed on this idea that we could do a podcast where we interviewed people about their experience doing live ops. And I was like, okay, we'll give it a shot. And our original idea was we were going to do it entirely at like game convention. We were going to do it at GDC and E3 and Gamescom when game developers were all in the same place. We just grab people and have these like 20 to 30 minute conversations with them about live ops. Really quickly, like the pandemic started and it was like really hard to do that. So we just started recording them as longer form interviews over like on Zencaster, which, is like a platform that we're currently on, recording this podcast. And I really loved it. Like I loved doing it. I love talking to people about their stories and hearing all of the things that they've done in live ops. Everyone has great like live ops stories. So I kind of kept doing it and kept like just organizing guests. And like eventually, James got busy and had other things going on. And I did like quite a handful of them on my own and really enjoyed it. I wish it wasn't so time consuming. I keep like, it's like the Art of LiveOps is my perpetual like thing on my list that's like, I'm gonna get back to this like really soon and do another season, and I'm not giving up on it. But it is the thing that's hard if anyone's thinking about starting a podcast. The thing that's hard is scheduling guests. to me, that was like the thing that was like really hard, was like coordinating with people and trying to like get around their schedule and everything and get them to come do it en masse. But I really love doing it. I've just really enjoyed being more out there as well. I think it's good. You meet people and you get your perspective expanded too, because you get people's take on the things you're saying.
Absolutely. I mean, already I feel very fortunate to get to know you better. And I think it's really nice that everyone else gets to hear more about you as well. It's an honor. One last question for today. Mm-hmm. What are your plans and goals for the future?
This is a big one. Like when you sent me like the list of possible questions, I was like, "Oh, this is deep." You know, I'll sort of give the like work answer. Like it's at Xbox Game Studios Publishing sort of developed a strategy and started working on it. It takes a lot of years for games to get done, and a lot of my focus right now is just executing that. Like we started a lot of things. I want to get them over the finish line. Like I want to help teams like make their way out the door and like into live production and all of these things. And we're getting there. So that like in an interesting way, like the next couple of years for me, I think looks a lot more like execution and getting things done, which will be good. Like, and that still feels good. Still love to do that. So I want to do that. And, at the same time, like I want to grow my team. Like I want my team to like feel like greater ownership of things. I want them to like get more opportunities. I want to see them like, take on new challenges and get new skills and grow. And like, so there's a lot of that too, like just feelings of like wanting to invest in people in our team and like see them do more and more, and things that, I think, maybe even they might think like, oh, 5 years ago, I couldn't do this. Like that's really motivating for me. And so I plan to do that. That's like, I'm going to do that. I'm going to make that happen. And then for me too, there's also thoughts about, weather the storm of the industry. That's like always a goal. The industry is always in turmoil. It's always hard. I think we're going through a rough time right now. Weather that, stay sane, keep some balance, make pottery, plant trees. Like, like make sure, like I joke, but honestly, like make sure there's room for that. Like, and then I'm not just doing game stuff all day, every day. I do try to play as much stuff as I possibly can. I want to stay in a position where like I have my hands on a lot of things, but I think more and more I also think about leaving room for other things, because I also think you're never going to be super effective at any creative job if you are like you only have one focus in your whole life and like you spend all of your time doing one thing.
I think that's a great tip. I've heard that it's really healthy to just go out and take a walk for about 20 minutes a day, and
yes,
it's supposed to bring peace to any turmoil that's happening and help sort out any issues that are going on and kind of balance life out. Although I feel like your goals and plans for the future and your considerations are kind of trending towards that as well, like just balancing out and
I would like balance. That would be great. These are my hopes for the future. Balance. I think it's a good goal though. As you said, like leaving room to connect with nature sometimes and to make things. I think that's always important to me. Like I always want to be making something like physically. That's just something that is important to me and makes me feel more in tune with myself. So that's always a big one for me too.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. It's been a really great pleasure, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Thanks for listening to this latest episode of the Rise and Play podcast. I am growing a community of conscious leaders across the industry and beyond. If you want to join this movement, please share the podcast with other conscious leaders, because we have so much more we can learn from each other. If you've enjoyed this episode, please follow and rate the show on Spotify or your other favorite podcast platform. It will help other growing leaders to discover the show and benefit from the valuable insights. If you would like to grow rapidly your leadership skills, you can find more insights on riseandplay.io, where you will also find my free masterclass on conscious leadership and other resources that I offer. Have a great week, and remember to take care of yourself. Until the next time,